Russia's military mission creep advances to a new front. Africa. Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. Russia has been steadily expanding its military influence across Africa, alarming Western officials with increasing arms sales, security agreements, and training programs for unstable countries or autocratic leaders. In the Central African Republic, where a Russian has been installed as the president's national security advisor, the government is selling mining rights for gold and diamonds at a fraction of their worth to hire trainers and buy arms from Moscow. Russia is seeking. Sudan's president, Omar Hassan al-Bashir, brought in Russian mercenaries in January to help shore up his rule against nationwide protests. And last spring, Russia, entrenched in Africa during the Cold War's violent East-West rivalry, largely retreated from the continent after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But in the past 2 years, expanding Moscow's military sway on the continent reflects Mr. Putin's broader vision of returning Russia to its former glory. But it also illustrates Russia is also a growing challenge and has taken a more militaristic approach in Africa. General Thomas D. the by unknown assailants in the Central African Republic, a former French colony, last year drew attention to the Kremlin's return to the continent. The journalists were investigating the activities of the Wagner Group, a private military force founded by a former Russian intelligence officer and linked to an associate of Mr. Putin. Russia said in Moscow and its private military contractors are arming some of the region's weakest governments and backing the continent's autocratic rulers, said Judd Devermont, director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. This engagement. Late last year, the White House revamped its economic and security policies toward Africa, including plans to increase access to financing for projects on the continent. UN administration officials have fanned out on the continent to drum up support for the plan. In March, under the Trump administration, the Pentagon has shifted focus to confronting global threats, largely from China and Russia, and away from fighting terrorist organizations. In December, the Kremlin, Mr. Bolton said at the time, continues to sell arms and energy in exchange for votes at the United Nations, votes that keep strong men in power, undermine peace and security, and run counter to the best interests of the African people. But many African nations appeared unconvinced. Some 24. The United States military has a relatively light footprint across Africa. About 6,000 United States troops and 1,000 Defense Department civilians or contractors work on a variety of missions throughout Africa, mainly training and conducting exercises with local armies. Moscow cannot compete with American foreign aid or on the continent. But analysts said Russia is seeking more strategic bases for its troops, including at Libyan ports on the Mediterranean Sea and at naval logistics centers in Eritrea and Sudan on the Red Sea, according to a research organization in Washington. Last year, Russia signed agreements on military cooperation with Guinea, Burkina Faso, Burundi, and Madagascar. Separately, 13% of Russia's total arms exports in 2017 were sent to Africa, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Russia is courting. Nearly 80% of all Russian military sales across the continent are to Algeria, a longtime customer, Pentagon officials said. Tunisia, and Egypt, a staunch American ally, is also becoming a solid customer of Russian weaponry. Egypt signed a deal. Russia has military technical cooperation programs with a number of African countries, and helps them equip national military forces with modern weaponry, the Russian embassy in Washington said in a statement. All these undertakings, the ties between Russia and the Central African Republic, have drawn particular attention in the West. The two countries, Russia has bolstered its influence with increased military cooperation including donations of arms, with which it has gained access to markets and mineral extraction rights, General Waldhauser said in March in testimony before the House Armed Services Committee. With minimal investment, the United States Treasury Department 2 years ago imposed sanctions against the mercenary company, which is also known as PMC Wagner, accusing it of recruiting and sending soldiers to fight alongside pro-Russian separatists in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine. Recruits from the 2 weeks ago, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Mikhail Bogdanov, discussed prospects for broadening cooperation with President Faustin Archange Ouattara of the Central African Republic. The increased aid, the announcement drew a cool response days later from senior French officials. We feel very much. Russia is also seeking new economic markets and energy resources, in some cases rekindling relationships with countries that were in place during the Soviet era. Russia has they are trying to seize the spoils. General Tony Thomas, Neil MacFarquhar contributed, reporting from Moscow.
Raindrop, drop top smoking, no cooking the hot pot. Fucking on your bitch, yeah, that. Looking up, open the park pot.